Okay, we'll get started. Good evening, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to this event tonight. Black History event. We're going to talk about Forgotten Heroes, a story of Americans, African Americans, veterans, soldiers, South Carolinians in the First World War. And this is being given by the University of South Carolina Veterans Alumni Council. So I'm going to start with some thank yous. First, the Veterans Alumni Council is an affinity group of the University of South Carolina. We are part of the Alumni Association, and we work to help veterans and their families. The group of organizations been around for about 5 years, done some great work. And one of the things that we have done is we've established a Salute to Service scholarship that was recently endowed. And if you would like to contribute to that, that is on the alumni webpage. But some great work that's being done by the Veterans Alumni Council. I'd also like to thank the Veterans Alumni Council members who are attending tonight, to include Lisa Yanity, who is the chair. And again, I am Keith June, Colonel retired, and I am the chair of the Veterans Alumni Council. I'd also like to thank Simone Keller, who is our liaison to the Alumni Association, and Ms. Chardonnay Ishmael, who is providing IT support tonight. A couple other people that were just very helpful with this. One is the Black Alumni Council. I met with Chanel Singletary several times, and we talked about that, and they also publicized this event this evening. Also, Mr. John Holloman, who's been a wealth of information. He is a amateur historian, to some extent a real historian, but has done just an incredible amount of work on the 371st. He hails from South Carolina and has some personal details on some of the soldiers from the 371st who hailed from Greenwood County, where he's from in South Carolina. Also would like to thank my partner in crime, who's out there somewhere, Colonel retired Linda Jansen, who teaches at National War College and does some work, teaches some classes on World War I, and she also has provided some very valuable information. And with that, we'll do the formal introductions. And with me is Mr. Mike Knapp. Mike is the Director of Historical Services at the American Battlefield Monuments Commission. If you're not familiar with the American Battlefield Monuments Commission, and Mike, tell me where I go wrong on this, but the American Battlefield Monuments Commission is the agency that is responsible for the cemeteries and monuments overseas. So when you go to Europe, if you go to Paris to Cernès, American cemetery that overlooks Paris, it is the American Battle Monuments Commission that has the responsibility for taking. Or if you go to Omaha Beach, and right, the cemetery there, one of the more well-known ones, the American Battlefield Monuments Commission is the organization that is responsible for that. Mike is a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. He also holds advanced degrees from George Mason University and George Washington University. He is also a retired soldier and has deployed several times, to include in 2014, where Mike and I were deployed to Afghanistan, and that's where I got to know Mike. So Mike, thank you very much. Mike has provided really the great majority of the expertise and information about this. Also, we are just absolutely delighted to have with us Ms. Sonia Grantham. Ms. Grantham hails from Columbia. She is a direct descendant. She's the granddaughter of Mr. Sancho Thompson, who was a soldier in the 371st. She has just done an incredible amount of work to keep alive the memory of the 371st, to include an effort to build a monument to the 371st on Fort Jackson, and that monument has been approved. So if you'd like to learn more information about that, I direct you to the 371st monument, which is online. And Ms. Grantham and Mike, please jump in as we do the presentation this evening. Okay. With that, I will share my screen. I have put together a slide presentation that provides an overview of the First World War, the United States in the period of the First World War, African Americans, and then information on the 371st and Corporal Freddy Stowers. Corporal Freddy Stowers was the first African American recipient of the Medal of Honor in the First World War. And one of the reasons I invited Mike this evening was Mike played a key role in helping Corporal Stowers be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He wasn't awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor until 1991. And there's a story to that, and we'll cover that. But at this point, I'll share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. We call this Forgotten Heroes. The First World War is not a conflict that most Americans are familiar with. I mean, I think most folks have heard about it, but they don't have a lot of detail about it for a couple of reasons. One, it was a long time ago. Two, it was overshadowed by the Second World War. And I think the other thing is that, there wasn't as much written about the First World War as there was, say, the Second World War. And again, it was so long ago that we just don't know as much about it. I call this Forgotten Heroes because I think a lot of folks may not realize that 10% of the soldiers in the First World War were African Americans. And during the war, there were 2 African American divisions that we'll talk about in more detail. But one of the regiments in one of those divisions, it was a provisional division, was the 371st. And 371st Infantry Regiment was a regiment composed of Black soldiers and white officers that were primarily from South Carolina. There's a photo here, and the photo says a lot. The photo is a private who is in the 3rd Battalion of the 371st. I don't have his name, but what's interesting about it, as you look at this soldier, you'll see a couple of things that stand out. He's wearing an American uniform, but he has a French helmet, a helmet that was issued to the French forces, and he also has a French rifle. And the backstory there is that the 371st, when they got to France, they were assigned to fight with the French. And there are several reasons for that, and we'll get into more detail on that. But it's an incredible story. The story of the 371st is it's a powerful one. It's one of an inspirational one, but it says a lot about our nation and the First World War during that period. Mike, anything to add?
No, I think, Keith, I think the point that you make that's so important is in your title, Forgotten Heroes. When you look at that, at the number of African Americans that served in the First World War, and the number that we know about, and the units that we know about, it's really only the tip of the iceberg. And so I think a lot of these guys are forgotten to history. And that's something that I think there's a lot of us that would like to see rectified, and hopefully this conversation of ours starts that going and gets people thinking about it and talking about it.
So there's some very well educated personnel out there, some folks that have spent a lot of time on this subject. So I have condensed the First World War into about 3 slides. So for you great historians out there, and I'm sincere about that. There's some really smart folks out there. You can send me hate mail later, but I'm trying to get through this as quickly as we can. But just some comments about the First World War. And I'll start with the statement from President Woodrow Wilson, called it "Making the World Safe for Democracy." And we'll talk in more detail about President Wilson. But World War I is often called the Great War, and I think folks looked at it that way before the Second World War. It was a huge conflict, global conflict that fought between 1914 and 1918, with over 100 countries involved. It involved the Allies versus the Central Powers. The major Allied powers, and again, I'm being as succinct as possible, was the British Empire, the French Empire, Russia, and the US. I say British Empire because it was more than Great Britain. It was more than the United Kingdom. At this point, Australia is an independent country, as is Canada, as is New Zealand. But those 3 countries provide huge numbers of soldiers to the British during the First World War, as well as India, which was still part of the British Empire during this time period. I think India provided somewhere around 500,000 soldiers. I also say the French Empire, again, it was more than France. And that really plays a part with the 371st, because the French have a great many what's termed colonial soldiers from French North Africa and from French areas like Senegal, And in fact, the division that the 371st becomes a part of, the 157th, was actually a French colonial division. I'll add Russia as well. Russia was an Allied power at the start of the war. They actually they left in 1917. They were defeated by the Germans, which led to the Russian Revolution, which is a whole nother story. And then, of course, the U.S. The U.S. doesn't actually enter the war until 1917. The major Central Powers were the Austro-Hungarian Empire, think Austria and Hungary, Germany, which I think, Mike, and correct me if I'm wrong, provided the bulk of the soldiers for the Central Powers, and then the Ottoman Empire. And you kind of see those two empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, which basically ended after the First World War.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, Keith. And for the terms of our conversation, it's primarily the Germans that the Americans are facing on the Western Front.
The war starts in 1914, and again, we could spend a couple of hours talking about why the war started, how it started, but it starts in 1914. Much of the war, it's trench warfare. The Germans are stalled early on, and really it's trench warfare. And I think suffice it to say that the war is measured in meters. I mean, just yards versus hundreds of miles. I mean, there weren't great advances until the very end of the war. Is that Mike, right? Mike, is that?
Yeah, that's pretty much true. It becomes a stalemate very quickly, and it's not really until about 1918 that it becomes a war of movement again. And the U.S. plays a part in that, but yeah, for the most part, everybody's 100 yards apart at most, and less in some instances for 3 years.
I'd also, again, the U.S. doesn't enter the war until 1917. And then even with that, some U.S. units get to Europe, get to France in summer of 1917, but really the bulk of the U.S. forces aren't there until around spring, summer of 1918. It's the start of the modern army. People say that a soldier from today could go to a U.S. Army unit in the First World War and understand the formations, understand the staff. It's the first modern war. There are airplanes, modern communications, there are tanks, and chemical warfare. In fact, I think probably there was more chemical warfare in the First World War than probably any war since. Is that fair, Mike?
I would say so. I mean, in terms of major conflicts, I mean, you ran into some uses in other areas, but and it's a bit the volume of the use of chemical warfare in the First World War is one of the big reasons that we don't see it in the Second World War, because of the experience of it in the First World War, that there was a lot of movement not to use it, although everybody was ready to.
The war ends in 1918. In fact, November 11th, 1918, which today we call Veterans Day. In the Commonwealth countries, it's referred to still as Armistice Day. But the war ends on November 11th of 1918. And it ends with an armistice, which an armistice is an agreement to stop fighting. There's not a formal peace treaty until later on. And I think many historians would say that the peace treaty that ended the First World War led in some measure to the Second World War. At the end there, and again, we could spend a lot of time talking about this. It's the breakup of empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Just a little bit about the United States, America in 1917. President Wilson is elected on a "He kept us out of war" campaign slogan. He ran on that, and he's elected in 1912. He's reelected in 1916. Back then, the inauguration wasn't held until March, unlike today when it's held in January. But he asked for a declaration of war in April, so 1 month after. Actually, I think it was less than a month after his inauguration. He asked for a formal declaration of war against the Central. Is that right, Mike? Anything?
Yeah, April the 6th, 1917.
Just a little bit about President Wilson, who, by the way, has a South Carolina Columbia connection. He lived part of his youth in Columbia. In fact, where he lived is now in a museum. Wilson is the first person from the South elected president since 1848. Again, he asked for a declaration of war in April of 1917. The U.S. profited heavily from the war, especially in the early stages, by selling any number of things to the munitions. In fact, that's one of the concerns that the Germans had, and one of the reasons that the Germans had submarine warfare was an attempt to starve off the British. The Army and the Navy were very small. The Army was somewhere around 120,000, and most of that was out west. One of the things we'll talk about in just a little bit was the punitive campaign, punitive expedition that was led by General Pershing into Mexico in 1916 in an effort to capture Pancho Villa. There was a significant immigrant population, very large immigrant population. But one of the key factors with the African American stories was because the war disrupted the immigrant flow into the United States. Northern factories needed workers, which led in part to the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. During this period, before the First World War, about 90% of African Americans lived in the South. Anything to add to those, Mike?
No, I think you're right. I think, the thing that we have to think about all the time when we talk about World War I is in 1917, America is not a world power, we're in any sense of the word. And one of the things that we like to talk about with World War I is the long shadow of World War I. And these are some of the real key points that come out of that. And I think you're going to speak to more of them later. But no, it's important to remember that we're kind of maybe not a third world country, but we're not a first world country in 1917.
The other thing is that there's significant anti-war efforts, and I'm not sure people realize that again, Wilson campaigns on he kept us out of war in 1916. Also, I want to make sure that Ms. Grantham, if you have anything to add, just from any personal details, anything about your family. I can tell you is I think almost every African-American family with reference to the Great Migration, to include mine, has family members that left South Carolina and went north to New York City or Philadelphia. But that's a key part of the African-American story. So just some notes about African-Americans during this period. So in response to President Wilson's slogan about making the world safe for democracy, A. Philip Randolph says, "We'd like to make Georgia safe for the Negro." This is a period of extreme racial terrorism. You see the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915. Again, Wilson is from the South. He believes in segregation. He does not believe in equality for African Americans. He formally institutes segregation in the federal government. East St. Louis is, and other American cities, African American parts of cities are burned. Jim Crow laws are firmly established in the South. And again, this is a period of Black migration to northern cities, in part for jobs, but probably more importantly, for just the extreme racial terrorism and repression in the South. And there are kind of two big schools of thought in the African American community, which kind of mirrors the nation about the First World War. One is A. Philip Randolph, who sees the injustice, the racial injustice in the United States, and says, "Hey, you know what? Why should we support this war when there's so much inequity in the United States, so much racial oppression in the United States?" The other school of thought is W.B. Du Bois, who, and I think if you're somewhat familiar with American history, definitely African American history, you've heard of W.B. Du Bois, who was one of the leading Black intellectuals of the time. Du Bois is supportive of the war. And the idea is that if African Americans serve, then it shows patriotism, it demonstrates commitment to the nation. He encourages African Americans to serve. He gets a lot of flack for it, and we'll talk about that in more detail later. But he's very supportive of the war. And there is tremendous opposition to arming African Americans. The governor of Mississippi is a vocal opponent of arming African Americans, he makes lots of comments about, we don't want African Americans going to Europe where they might be treated as equals and coming back here and having unrealistic expectations. So there's a lot of opposition to arming African Americans. Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to say a lot of it too stems from there's the Houston riots of 1917, where the 24th Infantry is stationed in Houston, and there's a lot of scholarship on that. But these are regular infantry soldiers, and the town treats them horribly, and at some point they react to that, and I think they've even made a movie of it recently. Um, and so this is another reason in the South that sparks this great fear of, we don't want to have these trained bodies of men armed with modern weapons in our midst. And I think this kind of follows along for the same rationale that white America had even during the Civil War to arming African Americans. It's kind of a constant theme, and especially in Jim Crow South.
Just a little bit about the Army in the First World War. The Army is really small. It's about 120,000 soldiers. Most of that's out west. As I noted before, there's a punitive expedition in 1916 where General Pershing leads soldiers into Mexico, which includes, at this time, the Army's got two black units, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. And I believe one of those units was involved, at least one of those units was involved in the punitive expedition. Again, it's the start of the modern Army. There is a reinstitution of draft boards, but they are local. Pershing plans for about 100 divisions. They are adamant, the US government and Pershing, they're adamant that the US will fight as Americans, that we're not going to fight. The British and the French plan is, hey, you send us your soldiers and we'll put them in our formations. In fact, I think the British didn't want American officers above the rank of captain. They just basically wanted the manpower. They didn't want an American army. General John, nicknamed Blackjack Pershing, is appointed commander of the American Expeditionary Force, and that is the more delicate name, if you will, for General Pershing, who commanded black soldiers. And by the end of the war, over 4 million soldiers are in the Army. 2 million in Europe and about 2 million in the US. And Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think this is kind of what we alluded to before, that with the US becoming a world power by the end of the war, and the Army is kind of one example of this. That if you think about the growth from 120,000 to 4 million people under arms, it's amazing that they did this. And yes, the Americans are specifically told, and Pershing specifically has this to say, that the Americans are not going to be a part of the British or French army. We're going to fight as a unified American army. In point of fact, it doesn't quite work out that way till very late in the war. But yeah, Keith is correct that both the French and the British were like, send us a boatload of guys and we'll plug them in where we got vacancies. And the US refused to do that in the main.
This is a pretty powerful comment. This is from a note that I believe General Pershing sent to the French. And he said, we must not eat with them. And he's referring to African Americans. We must not eat with them, must not shake hands with them, seek not to talk to them outside the requirements of military service. We must not commend them highly, especially in front of white Americans. So as a retired soldier and somebody that spent 30 years in the Army, that's painful to read that, but that says a lot about, where our nation and where our Army was at that time. By the end of the conflict, by 1919, there's 400,000 African Americans, about 10% of the force. The Army initially plans for 16 divisions of black soldiers, but there's a lot of political pressure not to do that. Again, there's a lot of pressure not to have so many African Americans in combat. And Mike, if you want to talk about the draft deferments, when you look at the number of African Americans drafted versus the number of whites.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so fascinating is when you look at this period, that when the draft is created, I think Jennifer Keene, in some of her work, her scholarship, has published some great stuff on this. And the whole idea of the draft is colored by the experience of the draft riots in the Civil War. And so they want to have a way to do that without having the same negative impacts. So they come up with the term selective service. It's a benefit. You have been selected to serve. So they have local draft boards set up everywhere in all the communities, so that when people can go and get tested and, categorized as to whether they're fit to serve or not. And what I think is fascinating about this, there's this real irony in that the U.S. is drafting all these African Americans, but they don't want to put them in military service per se. They don't want to arm them, but they're also incredibly disinclined to give any of them a deferment on any reason, whether it be compassionate or, they have a family or, unless they're physically totally incapable of serving, it's almost impossible for them to get a deferment. And I think this kind of speaks to the real, the real problem that America is struggling with right now. We need to mobilize all of our manpower for this great effort. And these guys are part of it, but we don't want to treat them the same. And we're scared of using them, but we're not going to let them get out of it either. So it's a really kind of a weird dichotomy that's happening with regard to the draft and African Americans.
Yeah, just a couple other things that are one that's really interesting, and I really didn't know a lot about this until I started research for this. The Army establishes a provisional officer training school for African Americans at Fort Des Moines in Des Moines, Iowa. 639 officers are eventually company grade officers are trained at the provisional officer training school. And again, this was W.B. Du Bois was actually offered a slot. He declines, but one of the officers who is trained is Charles Hamilton Houston. And if you don't know who Charles Hamilton Houston was, he after attending the school, he goes to Europe. He comes back to the States. He goes to Harvard Law School. He's a graduate of Howard. He after the war, he goes to Harvard Law School. He becomes the dean of the Howard University Law School. And one of his students was Thurgood Marshall, who eventually sat on the Supreme Court, and as importantly, was the lead attorney in such important civil rights cases as the Brown decision. And oh, by the way, Charles Houston also was involved with many civil rights cases, including the Brown decision and decisions in the 1930s. But there are other key officers trained, and more than officers, but people that played a prominent role in the civil rights movement. That I don't think a lot has been written about it so far. There's more being written about it right now. In the 1930s, kind of the early stages of the civil rights movement. But the reality is that the vast majority, 80% of the African Americans who serve in what's called SOS, Service of Supply. So they're quartermaster, they're stevedores. In fact, I have a distant relative who was a stevedore in the First World War. I remember my grandmother telling me about that, and I didn't know what a stevedore was. But our engineer units, in fact, Mike has done a lot of work on pioneer engineer battalions. And it's interesting, in the Second World War, this is still pretty much the case. I had my grandfather and two uncles served in the Second World War, and they all served in the engineers. Other African-American families, I know, the Red Ball Express, but that sort of continues into the Second World War. Mike, anything to add on that?
No, I was just going to say, I think that's that's kind of the solution when we look back at the idea of how many African Americans serve and how there's so few that are actually in combat units. The answer is that they put them in the side of the traditional jobs that they would have employed them in back here in the States. So they're unloading the ships, they're working in warehouses, they're building roads, they're tearing down old buildings that are going to fall down. And so there's a lot of these soldiers that that are drafted and think they're going to do their bit, and frankly they do. I mean, let's be honest. Anybody that's been in the military, that tooth to tail ratio is ridiculous, and it's enormous in World War I. But they don't ever get in the fight per se. But it's true, that's the vast majority of them, and even the ones that are in the pioneer infantry units that Keith was referring to, they tend to, again, be sort of sloughed off into these labor kind of roles. And honestly, that I think that's the way the American Army looks at them over there. Is
It looks like Mike's frozen. He should come back. Under pressure from the NAACP and other groups, the Army establishes two divisions. We'll talk about those divisions right now. Mike, are you back? All right. The Army establishes two African American divisions. The first is the 92nd, and I've listed, there were 4 regiments, the 365th, the 366, 367, 368, and 2 machine gun battalions, the 350th and the 351st. There is also the 93rd. The 93rd is provisional, and what that means is that it doesn't have, the Army doesn't equip it with all of the other stuff that comes with the division. It doesn't get artillery. It has a small division headquarters that's eventually deactivated. It doesn't have engineers. It doesn't have support. So the Army really kind of creates the 93rd on the cheap. The 93rd has 4 regiments, the 369th, the famous Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th, the 370th, our 371st, and the 372nd. So just a little bit about the 93rd and the 371st. And I'm not sure if if we've got Ms. Grantham. Ms. Grantham's out there if you want to add anything to this. So the 371st consists primarily of draftees, primarily from South Carolina. It's interesting that the draftees can't report until after the cotton crop is harvested. So they don't get there to Fort Jackson until probably around November of 1917. They're organized and they have initial training at Fort Jackson. They arrive in France in April of 1918. They are assigned to the 157th French Division, which is a colonial troops division. They're known as the Red Hand Division. They were actually decimated in the early stages of the war, 1914, 1915. They were reconstituted with the 93rd. They're given French equipment and French helmets. Now the French are just absolutely elated to have soldiers, because they've been at war now for 4 years. In fact, there are mutinies. French soldiers are refusing to fight after so many years of war. At this point, there are millions of soldiers who have been killed. So the French are really happy to have anybody. But what's interesting about this is, so again, we emphasized before that General Pershing was pretty persistent that the U.S. would not, round out, add soldiers to the British and the French formations. But he decides, and the leadership decides, that it's better to have the 371st serve in this French division, because they're not comfortable having African Americans serve in a U.S. formation. And in fact, one of the comments the French make is that they cannot understand just a cruel racism in the United States. But they and I don't think this was an operational decision, not really, maybe to some extent, but really it had to do with just the virulent racism and that existed in the U.S. and the U.S. Army at that time. So again, the 371st serves with the 157 French Division. In September of 1918, they are assigned to capture Hill 188, which is in the Champagne region of France. The unit captures as objective Hill 188, so that's a mistake on my part. And the unit serves as the apex for the attacks between September of 1918 and October of 1918. The unit serves with distinction. 22 soldiers are awarded with the Distinguished Service Cross, and 123 soldiers and officers are awarded the Croix de Guerre, the French Cross of War. And Corporal Freddy Stowers receives the Medal of Honor. Now, he doesn't actually receive the Medal of Honor until 1991. And again, Mike was instrumental in helping Freddy Stowers receive the Medal of Honor in 1991. This is a comment from a memo from General Gobet. And forgive me for butchering French, and this is what he said with reference to the 371st. In transmitting to you with legitimate pride the thanks and congratulations of the General, allow me, my dear friends of all ranks, Americans and French, to thank you from the bottom of my heart as a chief and a soldier for the expression of gratitude for the glory which you have lent our good 157th Division. I had full confidence in you, but you have surpassed my hopes. During these 9 days of hard fighting, you have progressed 9 kilometers through powerful organized defenses, taken nearly 600 prisoners, 15 guns of different calibers, 20 Minenwerfers, which are German, it's a German mine thrower, and nearly 150 machine guns, secured an enormous amount of engineering material, an important supply of artillery ammunition, brought down 3 enemy airplanes. The red hand, sign of the division, thanks to you, became a bloody hand which took the Boche, which means it's a derivative term, it's a derisive term for the Germans, by the throat and made him cry for mercy. You have well avenged our glorious dead, signed General Cabet. Just a lot to say about that. And I think that one thing is just leadership, that the French had confidence in the 371st, the 371st had confidence in themselves, and they refused to be defined by greater society. Just some photos, and I think these are great photos of the 371st. Again, you see the American uniforms, the boots, but you also see the French helmets and some of the French kit, to include the ammo cartridge boxes that the soldiers have. A photo of the 371st in the trenches. And one neat thing about the First World War was that there was photography. So we have images of the soldiers during that period. And I think these photos were actually photos taken by the French. Really neat photo here, and you can kind of see the stages if you look closely. This is a 371st as they arrive, but they still have the field cap, some of them, and they're transitioning to the French helmet. And we get to Corporal Freddy Stowers, and I am going to play for you a little bit of the presentation where Corporal Stowers' family was awarded the Medal of Honor. This was in March of 1991, so about 30 years. This is right after Desert Storm. What's interesting is that he still had 2 sisters that were still living at that point. And I'm going to play this.
A true hero, a man who makes us proud of our heritage as Americans, a man who in life and death helped keep America free. I speak of Corporal Freddy Stowers, to whom posthumously we present our highest military award for valor, the Medal of Honor. It's an award for bravery and conscience, that compendium we call character. Today, Corporal Freddy Stowers becomes the first Black soldier honored with the Medal of Honor from World War I. He sought and helped achieve the triumph of right over wrong. He showed, as this year has proved again, that an inspired human heart can surmount bayonets and barbed wire. 73 years ago, the Corporal first was recommended for a Medal of Honor, but his award was not acted upon. In 1987, then Congressman Joe Diagardi and my friend, the late Mickey Leland, known to many here from Houston, discovered the Stowers case while conducting other research. And the Army took up the case. And last November, the Secretaries of the Army and Defense recommended that Corporal Stowers receive the Medal of Honor. I heard his story, accepted their recommendation enthusiastically. It's been said that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge. On September 28, 1918, Corporal Freddy Stowers stood poised on the edge of such a challenge and summoned his mettle and his courage. He and the men of Company C, 371st Infantry Regiment, began their attack on Hill 188 in the Champagne-Meuse sector of France. Only a few minutes after the fighting began, the enemy stopped firing, and enemy troops climbed out of their trenches onto the parapets of the trenches, held up their arms, and seemed to surrender. The relieved American forces held their fire, stepped out into the open. As our troops moved forward, the enemy jumped back into their trenches and sprayed our men with a vicious stream of machine gun and mortar fire. The assault annihilated well over 50% of Company C, and in the midst of this bloody chaos, Corporal Stowers took charge and bravely led his men forward, destroying their foes. Although he was mortally wounded during the attack, Freddy Stowers continued to press forward, urging his men on until he died. On that September day, Corporal Stowers was alone, far from family and home. He had to be scared as friends died at his side, but he vanquished his fear and fought not for glory, but for a cause larger than himself, the cause of liberty. Today, as we pay tribute to this great soldier, our thoughts continue to be with the men and women of all our wars, who valiantly carried the banner of freedom into battle. They too know America would not be the land of the free if it were not also the home of the brave. The soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen of Desert Storm, a group that includes Staff Sergeant Warren, all these valiant Americans are heirs to the legacy of Corporal Stowers and the men of Company C. No nation could be more proud of its sons and daughters than we are of them. Today, we celebrate their achievements, but we also heed these words echoing over the centuries. Only the dead have seen the end of war. We owe it to Freddy Stowers and those who revere his legacy to defend the principles for which he died and for which our great country stands. In that spirit, I am honored to welcome two of his sisters, Georgina Palmer of Richmond, California, and Mary Bowens of Greenville, South Carolina. They will accept the award on behalf of their late brother, the text of which I will now ask Sergeant Major Byrne to read the citation.
The President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, March 3rd, 1863, awards, in the name of the Congress, the Medal of Honor posthumously to Corporal Freddy Stowers, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Corporal Freddy Stowers distinguished himself by exceptional heroism on 28 September 1918 while serving as a squad leader in Company C, 371st Infantry Regiment, 93rd Infantry Division. His company was the lead company during the attack on Hill 188, Champagne-Marne sector, France, during World War I. A few minutes after the attack began, the enemy ceased firing and began climbing up onto the parapets of the trenches, holding up their arms as if wishing to surrender. The enemy's actions caused the American forces to cease fire and to come out into the open. As the company started towards and when within about 100 meters of the trench line, the enemy jumped back into their trenches and greeted Corporal Stowers' company with interlocking bands of machine gun fire and mortar fire, causing well over 50% casualties. Faced with incredible enemy resistance, Corporal Stowers took charge, setting such a courageous example of personal bravery and leadership that he inspired his men to follow him in the attack. With extraordinary heroism and complete disregard of personal danger under devastating fire, he crawled forward, leading his company towards an enemy machine gun nest, which was causing heavy casualties to his company. After fierce fighting, the machine gun position was destroyed and the enemy soldiers were killed. Displaying great courage and intrepidity, Corporal Stowers continued to press the attack against a determined enemy. While crawling forward and urging his men to continue the attack on a second trench line, he was gravely wounded by machine gun fire. Although Corporal Stowers was mortally wounded, he pressed forward, urging on the members of his squad until he died. Inspired by the heroism and display of bravery of Corporal Stowers, his company continued the attack against incredible odds, contributing to the capture of Hill 188 and causing heavy enemy casualties. Corporal Stowers' conspicuous gallantry, extraordinary heroism, and supreme devotion to his men were well above and beyond the call of duty, follow the finest traditions of military service, and reflect the utmost credit on him and the United States Army. Signed, George Bush.
I think that concludes the service, but I'd like to ask the Vice President and Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, we're just back. Hey, Mike, are you out there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you
feel
now.
like-
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, am I there? Because I know we were texting to make sure I was here.
Yeah,
I
no.
am.
Do you want to provide just some of the background on the Medal of Honor for Corporal Stowers?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big file on this, and it's a fascinating story, and I don't want to take, all night to talk about it, but as you heard, as Keith alluded to, and as you actually heard the President Bush talk about in his opening there was a review done to determine the inequity in the award of the Medal of Honor for World War I and World War II. And as part of that, they started looking at World War I, and they identified a potential recipient in Corporal Stowers. And at the time, I was working at the National Archives as an archivist in charge of the records of the American Expeditionary Force, and had in my personal opinion, the great good fortune to work with the action officer, Captain Mike Velasquez, who was tasked to come do the research on this. And what they found, to sum this up, and there was a lot of research done both in American archives as well as in the French military archives. They found that following that action, there were actually 4 soldiers from the 371st who were recommended for the Medal of Honor. And 3 of those individuals had the awards downgraded by AEF headquarters, basically by purging. They were downgraded to Distinguished Service Crosses. For whatever reason, Corporal Stowers' case had never been finalized, acted upon in any way, whether downgraded or awarded. It had somehow presumably gotten lost. I mean, we'll never know what actually happened. But they'd never closed out that file. And so when they did this review, it became very easy. They didn't have to redo public law, which sets a time precedent on how long awards are. And most of you in the military know that as well, that there's a time limit where you can award somebody any kind of award. So Corporal Stowers' case was a very easy one. I personally would have to say that the other nominations certainly rose to the same level, but given the times, they got downgraded. But based on a lot of the research that was done, because it wasn't taken at face value, the teams went back and looked at those. They looked at the maps. They looked at the terrain. This is the Army's folks doing that. They sent 2 officers to France to do a lot of research on this. But they came back and they made the recommendation that it was in fact worthy of the Medal of Honor, and that it should be awarded to Corporal Stowers. And as you saw, the Army did that. And I think that was a really powerful moment. And in terms of World War I history, it righted a very grave wrong, which was under President Obama a little bit later, which was also addressed when they gave Henry Johnson a Medal of Honor, along with I think Sergeant Shemin was a Jewish soldier, and they felt that the same prejudice against that was against the African Americans was used against some of the minorities, specifically the Jewish soldiers. But in Corporal Stowers' case, it's a fascinating story, and I think it gives great hope to those of us in the military that while the Army or any service may not get everything right at the time, eventually they kind of do. So that's what happened with this. And as Keith said, I felt very privileged to be a part of this. And now working for the ABMC, every time I go over to the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery where Corporal Stowers is buried, I stop by and visit him because I feel a little bit of affinity with him now.
Hey, Ms. Grantham, are you, would you like to say anything? Yeah, it's, I'll tell you, I almost get emotional when I.
Excuse me, I can't seem to get in. I don't
Okay,
know.
there you go, Ms. Grantham, please.
Yes, what's interesting about this story, no one could locate the daughter, Minnie Stowers. And when you're doing research of any type, Minnie Stowers, the daughter of Corporal Freddy Stowers, was named after his sister Minnie. So I had to make sure that everything, all the records matched each other. And what I found out, nobody knew what happened to the daughter or to the mother. Minnie was placed for adoption in 1925. And when I spoke to Corporal Stowers, nieces and nephews, as well as his great nieces and nephews, they asked me would I conduct their family history research. And when I did, I found out that the daughter was in Anderson all the time. She was in high school there, and she lived with, she was adopted by this gentleman, John Eugene Groves, who served in World War I. His death certificate states that he was never in the war, but I found out that was not true. But I found out the daughter was still in Anderson all the time, and she never got to meet her first cousins or any of her aunts or uncles. And Stowers also had a brother to serve, but he wasn't in the 371st. He served during World War I. Also,
Fascinating, Keith, if I may, because I remember at the time when I talked to Captain Velasquez and he told me before, I was sworn to secrecy, but I was told that they were in fact going to award the medal. He said that they couldn't find any relatives. They were unaware of them, but by the time of the ceremony, they found the two sisters, and there's there were two grand nephews maybe that are introduced there that were serving in the military. So it was really kind of nice that they found it, but I never knew that about the daughter. That's fascinating.
yes, and so far, I think I'm the only person that knew, because when I was doing my research, I'm very thorough, and I followed her. She went to high school in Anderson. She worked as a maid, and I even have the name of the street where she resided. And I followed her, and then her mother moves away. And my theory is that Corporal Stowers told this gentleman if anything happened to him to look after his wife Pearl and the daughter Minnie. And he did get to meet his daughter before he went overseas. He did. And they got married. I think they got married in 1917. But I have the marriage license and everything. So yeah, it's been a real fascinating story. And the family and we kept in touch with each other. And I was supposed to go to Anderson, but they didn't have the reunion that year. I don't know what happened, but I was able to give them a lot of information that they did not know. And we used to have a reunion together. One of his nieces, she doesn't keep too well, but I've met them, and I've introduced the family to my children and all. So, yeah.
Great. Well, when I watched that and listened to the ceremony with President Bush awarding Corporal Stowers, I tell you, it's hard not to get emotional. And just so proud as an American, as an African American, as a South Carolinian, You know, nothing against the 369th, great unit, and they did incredible things. But, you know, when you read about World War I and about, you know, Black soldiers in the First World War, a lot you'll read about is the 369th, and for good reason, because, you know, they did some incredible things. But they, you know, they were primarily from New York City, from Harlem. The officers, white officers, a lot of them were from from Wall Street. So, and they generated a lot more publicity. So it's just great to, you know, tell the story of the 371st, because there's so many connections. And as Grantham, a friend of mine, likes to say that the greatest history is not what you read in books, it's our own history. So thank you very much for being here. We'll go to the last couple of slides here. This is a monument, the 371st monument, that is still in France. It was damaged. In fact, Mike has been there. It was damaged during the Second World War. It was hit not by purpose, I don't think, by a German artillery shell, but it's still there. In fact, there's a gentleman that maintains it. I've gotten a couple of emails from him over the years, but that monument was erected by the soldiers of the 371st.
Yeah, they took subscriptions to have that put up there, and it sits out in the middle of a field about one ridge over from Hill 188. And yeah, I think in World War II, it was a position the French were on, and the Germans were, you know, shelling them, and the monument took a little bit of damage. And there's a little plaque underneath it that says that, so you don't think it's, you know, just falling apart from disrepair.
Yeah, and just the last slide, and I just want to get through this quickly to give some time for questions. We return from fighting, we return fighting. And this is a quote from W.B. Du Bois. And again, Du Bois was very supportive of the war. In 1919, he actually traveled to Europe and he interviewed soldiers. Again, he took a lot of flack from other members of the African American community. And he wrote this, and he said, you know, we return from fighting, we return fighting, and again, fighting the racism and the injustice in the United States. Quite frankly, I think the war changed little in the lives of most African Americans. The 1920s were probably the peak of racial terrorism and oppression, to include the Red Summer of 1919, which had the Tulsa race riots. But I think, you know, most importantly, the war proved to African Americans that they were not less, and they wouldn't be defined as less. They wouldn't accept second-class citizenship. And you see a lot of leaders emerge, like Charles Houston, A. Philip Randolph. I find A. Philip Randolph very fascinating. Again, this is before 1920, and A. Philip Randolph was one of the organizers of the March of Washington in 1963. He also was one of the key individuals to get President Truman to execute Executive Order 99881 in 1948, which desegregated the military. And I think that was key, not just for the military, but for our nation. You think about that, that was before Jackie Robinson, before, you know, what we consider the modern civil rights movement. And then another name that I added was James Miles Hinton, who was head of the NAACP in Colombia, who was a World War I veteran. He served with the 369th, and he was instrumental in some of the major civil rights legislation actions in South Carolina. Another key part of this was that you saw the emergence of a Black middle class, which led to the Harlem Renaissance. As John Holman has noted, that World War I soldiers are the parents and the grandparents of later civil rights leaders. So with that, we will open the floor to questions. Do we have any questions? Okay. I'd like to ask Miss Grantham if she'd like to talk more about some of your efforts with the 371st and the monument that you're working on to be built.
Yes. What started all of this, my grandfather's photo hung in our living room when I was a little girl, and my mother always told me about her father, but she knew that the unit was famous, but she didn't know how famous it was. And during the summer of 2009, I went to this former slave cemetery, which ironically was formerly owned by Mr. Childs, who was the grandfather of the late the late General William Charles Westmoreland. And that's where my grandfather is buried on his former farm. But I had received a call from Joe Long at the Confederate Relic Room that the regimental flag was there. And I'm like, what? So me being the person I am, I went to see for myself. And when I went to view the cemetery, it's on the grounds of a former manufacturing plant in Richland County, Columbia, South Carolina. I decided back then that I was going to restore the cemetery and put a marker in the cemetery. So I've done both. One is a memorial marker, and this company in Ohio was so astonished by the story, they sent me another marker to put in the cemetery. And everything has been done with private funding, no grants, and I've done all the research. I've located a ton of descendants of the 371st. And I'm proud to be the granddaughter of a member of the 371st. It's been an amazing journey.
Thank you very much, Ms. Graham. And again, if you'd like some more information about the monument, the website is a 371st monument. Is that correct?
The 371st Infantry Regiment Memorial Monument Association. World War I Memorial Monument Association. My colleague, Mr. Russell Wolf, he decided on the name. So we are very good stewards. We don't touch the money. It goes directly to First Citizens Bank. So, and we file our, postcard every year. So efforts are on the way, and I need to get back to work on it to raise money.
Well, I'd like to, if there are no more questions, then I would like to thank Mike and thank Ms. Grantham for your time and your comments and the great information that you've provided this evening. I'm looking at the chat to make sure.
Yeah, Keith, I'm seeing a question that I don't know the answer to, but if Bill Holman's still, or John Holman, excuse me, I'm thinking of my old Scoutmaster. If John Holman's still around, he might have the answer. Somebody has asked, did the 371st have a regimental band? And we know the 369th had the band that became popular, of course, Jim Europe. But I don't know the answer to that quite on. I would think they probably did according to the TO&E, but I would like to hear, frankly, if they did. I don't know. So if Mr. Holman's still around, maybe he knows the answer to that.
Yeah, and I'm seeing just some comments from John Coleman. And John is a reenactor and again has very detailed knowledge of the 371st. And on Facebook, he has a page, Pershing's Mud Crunchers. So if you want to go to that Facebook page, Pershing's Mud Crunchers, for some more information. And also, I think Mr. Wolf had his hand up if he has a question or comment.
I just want to check and see, can anybody hear me? Yeah.
I can hear you.
Sorry, this is John Holman. Hey, so yes, every regiment did have a band. If you do go take a look at my Living History Group's Facebook page, Pershing's Mud Crunchers, we actually discovered, or I recently discovered through my background in French, a collection of French Army photography that included photos of the 371st. And there's actually a great image close up of the 371st band. The 369th definitely gets the credit for James Europe and his band bringing jazz. But each regiment had a band. There's also several images in that collection of the 370th band. And earlier, Jim made a comment about, did the 371st have African-American officers? And the answer is they did not. They had all white officers. They did have black NCOs. But interestingly enough, the 370th had a colonel who was black, which is really unheard of. That's kind of a unique story in and of itself. And the 372nd had several black officers as well, junior grade, not higher level.
Yeah, I think that's John's right. That's one of the big issues is, of course, right at the beginning of the war, Colonel Charles Young should have been in line to be promoted as a brigadier and had one of the black divisions, but the War Department wasn't about to have that happen. So you don't see anybody higher than a colonel. And I think with regard to the 370th, because they come out of the 8th Illinois National Guard, he was already in place. So it was I'm sure there was somebody trying to find a way to not get him to go, but yeah, to your point, John, it's a fascinating story.
Hey, just a couple other points, and there's so many South Carolina connections, obviously, but one of the key ones is, well, the 371st got back in 1919, in February of 1919, and there was a ceremony at Allen University, still there, still very prominent, an HBCU in South Carolina, and they were welcomed by the governor, Robert Archer Cooper, and I.S. Levy, and C.A. Johnson. Again, some big names in South Carolina. And I think Ms. Grantham has worked on a historical presentation display at Allen University that talks about the 371st.
Excuse me, Mr. Russell Wolf. He's my colleague. He can tell you about what we did at Allen because they had no knowledge of the 371st at the time this was done. And it was actually his museum that he placed at Allen during Black History Month about 4 or 5 years ago. So if my colleague, Mr. Russell Wolf, can come in, and I also have Ms. Hazel Blake Parker. Her grandfather served in the 371st as well.
This is Russell Wolf. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I
I
can hear you.
can.
Okay, I want to go back to the band because this is something I'm working on right now. The band leader for the 371st was one of the most premier military band leaders of his day. He retired from the 10th Cavalry. He had served in all the black regiments of that time. His name was Albert Williams. He had served in Cuba with the 24th Infantry, and later President Taft found out that all the band leaders in the black regiments were white. And so as they were either retired or left the units, they were appointed black band leaders, and Albert Williams was one of the first ones appointed there. And he also became the band leader at Tuskegee. And I'm trying to get his monument at Arlington updated because it doesn't have any of this information on it. I think it just basically says served in the 10th Cavalry. So that's kind of another forgotten piece. But again, when you've got $10,000 donated for your band in Harlem, and with all the wealthy New Yorkers, you just don't, again, it's like the Marines, they've got the best PR campaign. But no, we did take a group of items of artifacts from the 371st Infantry, including the weapons, the helmets, the French helmets, which the 371st, which I think, unlike the 369th, painted to match their uniforms. It was more of a mustard colored helmet that they wore. And various other, original uniforms of soldiers from the 371st, either officers or enlisted. And we put those on display at Allen. And it was well received. It was, again, nobody knows about these men. They don't know about this regiment. Going back to the 369th, the 371st was more highly decorated. They got the Croix de Guerre with palm. The regiment got that versus just the Croix de Guerre for the regimental, for the banners of streamers on your flag. So yes, I'm glad to hear this. I've been working on this since 1972 when my cousin died. He was an officer of the 371st, and I received his unit regimental history in another book and his platoon leader's whistle. He was Company B 371st, same battalion as Freddy Stowers. He was wounded almost the same time. He was and the lieutenant that was sent to take over from his platoon was killed almost immediately. And he was hospitalized for 2 years. and did not receive his medals until 1951. So the 371st, as a whole, was overlooked, by in many ways the military and America as a whole.
Hey,
I
Mr.
think,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, I think to your point, Mr. Wolf, that, one of the big problems that the 371st faces is, unlike all the other regiments in the 93rd, they're National Army guys, they're draftees,
Yeah.
whereas the others all come out of different National Guard units, and
Yeah.
especially the 369th and the 370th coming out of New York and Chicago, respectively.
Yeah.
They've got a good PR mechanism already in place, and so and there's that wonderful monument in Chicago to the 370th or the 8th Illinois, and so I think they kind of start out below the power curve on that respect, and then everybody, much like the active Army today, everybody kind of goes their separate way. There's no entity that kind of perpetuates them other than piecemeal that's determined. So yeah, you're right, and I think the work you're doing is God's work to keep that their memory alive.
Yeah, and our website is 371stmonument.org, 371stmonument.org, and we fundraising's been tough during COVID. And we're hoping to get ramped up again, and we're trying to get more interest in this regiment, and we appreciate everything you're doing.
Well, I think I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Just a couple of final comments, and I'll just turn to Mike. Anything final comments?
I guess my final comment would be what I've said. I think that this is an important part of our history, as both as the Army, as Americans, and the fact that we can have this discussion and get some people talking about it and thinking about it is probably one of the best things that we can do. And I'm very excited to hear the stuff that's going on, the stuff that John Holman's doing, his research, the monument. I'm phenomenally excited about that, and I'll be going to that website probably this evening after we're done here. So I think that's it. And Keith, thank you for the opportunity to be a small part of this. I love talking about World War I, and I could keep doing it until everybody's ears bleed, but I'll shut up.
Hey, Ms. Grantham, anything else? Any final comments?
Yes, it's one unidentified soldier. I would like to go nationally to see if someone would recognize his face. One of the news media outlets has promised to do it, and it has not been done yet, but he is a gentleman, part of the 371st. He has the patches on his on his uniform, and he's holding a little baby. The little baby is a little girl, and today she would be over 100 years old, like my mother. But I would love to put his face on national television to see if someone will recognize just who he is. So I would like some assistance, maybe Mr. Knapp, if you could help Ms. Blake and Mr. Wolf and I. It would be a great pleasure if we could get this thing broadcasted to see if we could find out who this man is, who he was.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we have a TV connection, but I'm happy to try and work with you to see what we can do.
Okay, all right.
And Keith has my information. He can give you my contact information.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. This was done as we observe and commemorate Black History Month. This is an incredible story. And again, as an American, as an African-American, as a South Carolinian, as a soldier, and as a veteran, this is just a very inspiring story. And I just want to, one of the comments in my discussions earlier today was with Grantham. She talked about one of the veterans from the 371st who is in an unmarked grave, and some of the work that she was doing. Part of our duty as veterans is to take care of each other. And it doesn't matter from which war if it's World War One or World War II, but to take care of each other. So, we, with the Veterans Alumni Council, we work with veterans and their families. So let's make sure we take care of each other. And I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Again, special thanks to Mike and to Ms. Grantham. And, when Mike and I started working on this months ago, one of the things he said was, if we could just get people talking, and I think we've definitely, succeeded in doing that, getting people talking and remembering and honoring the soldiers of the First World War, and making sure that no hero, none of our soldiers are forgotten. All right, that's all I have. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you. Great presentation.